Peter, welcome back into the back room.
Hey, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's talk about the big news of the week, the shutdown. How long do you think this is going to last? What, if anything, are you hearing when and if negotiations, real negotiations between both parties and Trump may happen, or are both sides just completely entrenched?
Yeah, I think both sides are fairly entrenched. They have the incentives on both sides to keep it going for a while. Trump doesn't want to give in to Democrats, doesn't want to work with Democrats, believes that this gives him an opportunity to further deconstruct the government while, in theory, it's shut down. On the other side, the Democrats are very anxious to show that they're willing to fight. They got in trouble. Leadership did. Schumer did earlier in the spring when he did go along with a spending resolution to keep the government going, and got a lot of blowback from the left. And this time, I think he's willing to make more of a fight out of it. And I think that they feel like that the healthcare issue, which is what they're insisting be in any spending bill, is a winner for them. It worked for them in the 2018 midterms, they believe, and they hope that it will be an important one going forward for them.
Yeah, well, in view of what you said about Schumer back in March, I believe it was, it's really hard to imagine a scenario where he and Hakeem Jeffries would throw in the towel anytime soon without getting anything substantive in return, and particularly with healthcare. That would be very bad for him. But more so, also, Democrats at home who've been demanding, as you've alluded to, more fight from the party, they'd grow even more dissatisfied with leadership. So it just seems like Schumer and Jeffries are really in a tough spot.
I think the recipe is there for, a possibly long-lasting shutdown for that reason. Because, in fact, I mean, look, in modern Washington, the word compromise is considered to be a dirty word just to begin with, right? If you're compromising, it means you're sacrificing principles. And there's the political reward structure has changed. It used to be that some sort of compromise was seen as a good thing by constituents and by members of the elected body, because they would have to go home to a district where they would appeal to people outside of their base. Today, of course, if you're a member of Congress, you're really focused more on your base than anything else. And your base wants a fight. It wants you to stand up, as it believes, for principle. Definitely there's a big strain of thought on the left that the Democratic leadership has been too willing to cave in to Trump. And so I think you're right. They are in bad position. It's hard to see how they can get a compromise that they can sell to their own constituents and that Trump would agree to.
Yeah, but and the interesting thing is everybody's talking about messaging. All the polls that came out this week show that Americans pretty overwhelmingly are blaming Republicans for the shutdown. And even more so, about 3/4 of Americans want the ACA subsidies to be extended, which is at the heart of the Democrats' fight. So it seems Democrats are winning the message war, right?
Well, that was what the polls show. You're right about that. And I think that's to some extent that's baked in, right? I mean, Republicans are seen just generally as the party that doesn't like government, and Democrats are seen as the party that does like government. So I think the assumption on the part of a lot of Americans who might not follow the ins and outs of it are that if the government is shut down, it's because Republicans don't like it and don't want it to be open, and Democrats do, and therefore they give Democrats the benefit of the doubt when it comes to issues like a spending shutdown. But that doesn't mean it would necessarily last. And that's the problem, of course. You never know how these things play out over time. Often the initial impression the public has, shifts as they get tired, perhaps, of a government that's not servicing them in the way they ought to be serviced. There are a lot of people out there who are out of work right now as a result of this. Federal employees are not being paid. And so we'll see how it lasts. But you're right. I think in the initial surveying anyway, it does show that the Democrats are on the more popular side.
It's interesting this morning, CNN showed some polling that, and I didn't know this, but with pretty much every other shutdown in the last couple of decades, Republicans have been blamed.
Yeah.
But to your point, they also showed some stats for the numbers when the shutdowns ended, and it stayed with Republicans as those at fault. But you're right. Today, conventional wisdom goes out the window, of course, and anything can happen, especially with Trump and this Republican Party. But it is interesting when you look at it from a historical perspective.
Yeah, again, I think it's partly just baked into the identities of these two parties, right? But it's also true that the last big shutdown during Trump's first term which lasted 35 days, the longest in history, and was seen as a huge moment of confrontation here in Washington, ultimately turned out not to be a big factor in the next election, right? Because so many other
Right.
things happened after that, including most importantly, COVID. And so, we don't know whether this shutdown will ultimately have, in terms of politics anyway, a long-lasting impact or not. But it certainly, I think, from the Democrats' point of view, is important to galvanize their side to feel like they are standing up and fighting after 8 months of basically taking it on the chin. And there's a lot of people, who could suffer as a result of the health care subsidies going away. So putting aside the politics of it, which may be crass, the policy implications are significant for millions of people who seem, who are on the edge of losing the help that they got from during the COVID period for affording health care, and it may put a lot of them, off of health insurance because they can't afford it anymore. So it's both important politically, but also, of course, on behalf of people who are at stake.
Yeah, and also this week we've seen the offensive and what Hakeem Jeffries called racist posts with him in a sombrero. Late last night, Trump posted this bizarre tone-deaf video with OMB Director Russ Vought as the Grim Reaper.
Yeah.
Trump himself has said the shutdown could be like a good thing because he gets to fire a lot of people and shut programs and all that. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of compassion or seriousness here. And it reminds us in a big way of the chaos and heartlessness of the Musk Doge period early this year. So maybe this is why Americans are blaming Republicans.
Yeah, look, I mean, Russ Vought has said it out loud. He has said he wants, he said this a while back, not directly in context of this shutdown, but in general, he says he wants federal workers to be in trauma. I mean, the idea is not just that we want to make government smaller and more efficient, which a lot of people might agree with, is that he wants to deconstruct the deep state and punish, in effect, those he sees as, part of it. It's not enough that people might have to lose their jobs. He wants them to suffer. He has said that. That's not somebody making it up. That's his own. Those are his own words. And I think that you're right in that sense. It doesn't come across to people who don't subscribe to that political philosophy as a thought through, considered approach to governance. I mean, you're right. These memes, these sombrero messaging is so.
It's like the chainsaw moment all over again.
Yeah,
like they didn't learn from that.
So bizarre. No president has ever done anything like this. It doesn't seem presidential right now. Not being presidential has worked for Trump, right? We all thought, well, nobody could get away with this, that, or the other thing that he's done.
Well,
and
it certainly also lends
with his base, at least.
It certainly lends credence to when folks say things like it's all about the cruelty, because it just consistently seems to be about like they're enjoying, to your point, the suffering of people. Which is so bizarre.
Even before the shutdown, I think Donald Trump in the last few weeks defined his domestic policy very succinctly in basically a sentence or so at the Charlie Kirk funeral. He says, "I hate my opponents and I don't wish them well." That's not a presidential message. I'm not saying that other presidents haven't also hated their opponents. They mostly probably did on some level or another, but they didn't give voice to it. They recognize that as a president, you have sort of a larger, higher responsibility to at least give lip service to the idea of being president for all the people and not looking to exact cruelty and so forth. But that's not something that Trump subscribes to, and it doesn't concern him that it looks cruel, as you say. It may be, in fact, part of the point.
Yeah, I think the Trump is not presidential train left the station about 9 years ago.
Yeah.
One
of these things is not like the other, although that old show has probably been canceled by now.
Are all these threatened terminations during the shutdown even legal, especially as the expenditures have already been appropriated by Congress?
Well, there's an argument about that. In fact, our friends at the Washington Post had a good story about the lawyers urging the administration not to engage in widespread layoffs during the shutdown, because in fact, when you lay people off, in many cases, you have to give them severance, and that's an obligation of spending, and they are not given permission at the moment to make obligations of spending because the government is supposed to be shut down, and Congress hasn't given them that permission. But what we've seen, of course, is an administration that doesn't respect the Congress's power of the purse. It's been willing to accrue to itself all kinds of authority to do things that Congress hasn't authorized. And, you know, so far it's had some success at winning in the courts. And I think that their view of this is try everything and get as far as you can and go as far as the courts will let you go and see if you can't push the envelope there. But it really is a drastic and significant shift in the separation of powers. And it goes back, of course, to the Nixon days, but it's really an important moment, and the shutdown is exacerbating and accelerating it.
And also, are there Hatch Act and or other violations occurring when the administration uses taxpayer money to blame Democrats for the shutdown on websites and on their out of office emails?
Yeah, again, you know, we overuse the word unprecedented, but I don't remember any time when the government websites, government messaging, which is supposed to be, you know, apolitical, nonpartisan. These government agencies represent all Americans. They're not supposed to be, you know, an adjunct of the RNC or the DNC. And yet, you're right, they're using them to put out a very partisan message. Now, lawyers tell us that that is potentially a violation of the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act is meant to keep politics, partisan politics, out of government. But we've seen with this president going back 10 years now that he doesn't really care if there are Hatch Act violations. And every time it's been brought up to him, he's basically ignored it, pushed it off. And there doesn't seem to be an enforcement mechanism that anybody can impose on him in that regard.
Well, this is a great segue into the next subject I want to ask you about, which is what you wrote about earlier this week in your New York Times piece titled, "In Going After Foes, Trump Sets a Precedent That Could Haunt His Allies." To me, it's essentially a what goes around comes around story. So why don't you talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, there's a reason why in government we accept limits on power when it's our turn in power, because there's going to be a time when we're not in power. And we don't want the other side to do to us, you know, what we might want to do to them, right? And this goes back 250 years. This is at the heart of our system, that people in power do not have you know, absolute power. And yet we have with Trump an example of a president who is claiming all sorts of powers to both prosecute his enemies now, what looks like to be very partisan, you know, Justice Department, and to go after free speech, not just speech that instigates violence or somehow defamatory, but actually speech that he just doesn't like because it's critical of him, and to seize the kind of power we're talking about over appropriations and take it away from the Congress. Well, there's going to come a day, at least we presume, in which he's not going to be in power and his people aren't going to be in power. And the question will then be, have you set a precedent for the other side to do things to you that you would have objected to had, you know, it not been for what you've done now to set that standard, to establish a new standard. You know, you hear conservatives talk about this. Tucker Carlson says, look, free speech is free speech. When they say hate speech, it's just, you know, it can be used as an excuse to come after us as well. So be cautious of that. You heard Ted Cruz say that the FCC chairman, Brandon Carr, sounded like a mafioso in trying to pressure ABC to take Jimmy Kimmel off the air, because Ted Cruz understands that if a Trump FCC can push broadcasters to take off people they don't like, that a Biden or some other Democratic FCC then would have the natural precedent to say, well, okay, then let's say Fox shouldn't have X or Y on the air. And so you're right, what goes around comes around, but there doesn't seem to be a thought at this point for the precedent is setting for after they leave office.
In the piece, you suggest that someone like FBI Director Kash Patel in particular should be concerned with this new precedent.
Well, look, Kash Patel's FBI and the Justice Department, you know, the Justice Department through Pam Bondi had just charged a former FBI director, James Comey, with lying to Congress. Okay. That's a case that the career prosecutors thought didn't hold up, wasn't a case to be made. And Trump basically ordered them to ignore the career prosecutors and go ahead and file the charges anyway, which is, again, something I can't remember ever seeing since covering the White House going back to 1996, in which a president directly orders, or at least gives the impression of an order, to the Justice Department to prosecute an individual enemy over the objections of the career lawyers who say there's no case there. So Kash Patel at this point has already been accused by Democrats like Dick Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut of lying to Congress himself, because he said during his confirmation hearings that he wouldn't politicize the FBI. And the Democrats say that's exactly what he's done. And therefore, why isn't that a lie that a future Kash Patel successor could say, well, that amounts to a crime as well. I'm not saying it is a crime. I'm not saying anybody would actually charge him. I'm just saying that, again, in this what goes around comes around theory of the case, he's now being accused in effect of basically the same thing he and his team and the Justice Department are accusing one of his predecessors of doing.
Yeah. For years, we've always heard that, like, you got to be careful when it's a Democrat's turn, blah, blah, blah. And then there'd be people say, but Democrats are never going to do this stuff. They're just not wired that way. They don't want to lie. They want to be above the fray. They're better than them, all that stuff. But something interesting is happening in this country. We see it in New York with Zoran Mamdani. You see AOC. You see people like Eric Swalwell and Jake Auchincloss, Jason Crow, others like that. There's a younger, new breed of Democrats who it's not that hard to believe that if they became in power, or if there was a president AOC, the point of your piece should be very well taken. And these people should be very concerned, because I don't think they're not the Dick Durbins and Chuck Schumers. They will exact retribution or whatever, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not saying that the Democrats would necessarily do the exact same thing that Trump has done or gone as far as he has gone. Certainly they have argued that he has abused power. So then to do the same things from the left that he has done from the right would expose them to charges of being hypocrites. Having said that, it doesn't mean that even if they don't go as far as Trump has gone, even if they take the precedent of it from what they think is a good government point of view, and you're a conservative, look at what you've done, right? What would a President AOC think about Defense Department spending that she thinks is wasteful and
Right.
better targeted for schools or healthcare or whatever? Could she then take the precedent that Trump has set and say, well, I'm not going to do what Congress said. I'm not going to buy that weapon system that Congress said we ought to buy, because I think I can use that money in a better way. So it's even in the most, good government argument kind of way, it sets precedents that future governments can use, even if they don't go as far or as expansively as Trump has. Conservatives, the point that conservatives are making is, we could be on the receiving end of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, to your point earlier about Ted Cruz, who you cite in the piece, he was one of the lone Republican voices to strongly rebuke the administration's attack on Jimmy Kimmel and free speech. He said, quote, "They will use this power and they will use it ruthlessly, and that is dangerous." He's a pretty calculating, crafty politician. Does he know something his colleagues either don't know or are refusing to accept?
Well, he's willing to say what they probably do know, right? I mean, he did say that. He's not often a critic of Trump these days, but he has also not been Trump's best friend. And he sees the future. He sees a future after Trump, and is obviously thinking about what that could mean for them. And yeah, I just think that from the Republican point of view, they look at what happened during Biden, when the Biden administration contacted these social media companies and said, look, you're putting all this disinformation about COVID or whatever online, and maybe you ought to think about that. They took that to be an example of government censorship. They filed lawsuits against it. They went all the way to the Supreme Court to make that argument that constituted the kind of censorship the government shouldn't do. Now, the administration says, look, we're just trying to combat disinformation. But one party's disinformation is the next party's, free speech. And this is the complicated, murky ground that we're in. And so I think a Ted Cruz looks at that and says, well, we complained about what they were doing with social media companies. If we end up doing even more so with ABC and CBS, the lawsuit that Trump filed against CBS that then, had the advantage of the FCC pressure over the merger. I mean, all these things, opened the door that another president someday down the road could use.
Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court in July of last year gave Trump near absolute immunity. He's been acting this year as if he's truly above the law. For all intents and purposes, is he above the law right now?
I mean, it certainly sent the message, right? I mean, they say, what they said was that you have immunity for clearly official actions. And even on things that are sort of debatable about whether they're official, there's at least a presumption of some sort of immunity, and any prosecutor would have to make the argument that that didn't count as an official action. Well, Trump certainly is acting as if he feels quite, liberated to do what he wants. He says he has the power to do what he wants. And it is a question of where the accountability is in the system right now. We saw in Trump 1.0 that impeachment, frankly, clearly is not a viable method of constitutional accountability anymore. As long as your party has 34 votes in the Senate, which is enough to block a 2/3 vote for conviction, then you're not going to be thrown out of office. And these days, the parties are so polarized, it's pretty hard to imagine the party of any president, but particularly Trump, breaking with him enough to convict him in an impeachment trial. Okay, so impeachment as a measure of accountability seems to be pointless at this point. Clearly, he's not deterred by it. He feels like he survived 2 impeachments, so therefore, what the heck? Go ahead, feel free. And so where is the matter of accountability? If you have Republicans in the Congress willing to cede their power in effect because they're not objecting to his accrual of power to himself, it's hard to see where he is, where he faces accountability. We'll see what the Supreme Court does on some of these other cases. But so far, they've been relatively supportive of a lot of the things he's done. And so he's had a clear path for 8 months.
Your piece is really about weaponization of the Department of Justice, the FBI. Trump ran last year on accusations of Biden and Democrats' weaponization of the Justice Department and promised to end the abuse of power. But in executing his retribution campaign, he's, in essence, turned the DOJ into his personal law firm and the FBI and ICE into his personal security team. So his weaponization, it's truly staggering in scope and scale, right? I mean, especially if you throw that unprecedented word around again.
Yeah. Well, and it's worth remembering, by the way, that this is what he wanted to do and try to do in his first term, right? In his first term, he regularly called for his political opponents to be prosecuted.
Right.
He regularly badgered and pressured his Justice Department to do that. He just happened to have a couple of attorney generals who refused, right? That whatever you think of Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, on a lot of the stuff that Trump wanted him to do, they wouldn't go along. Now he's got a different team there that is willing to go along. Now, they say, well, Biden did this first. Well, first of all, they're very different on the facts, and I think it's a much more complicated situation. Did the Democrats make a mistake in prosecuting Trump? There are some Democrats who would say they did because it would open up this argument. But it's worth remembering that Biden, as far as we can tell, never gave any direction to the Justice Department about what to do. He didn't even control the 2 state prosecutions in Georgia and New York. Biden did not sign executive orders targeting individual enemies of his, saying that they should be investigated. He didn't fire or push out a U.S. attorney because the U.S. attorney wouldn't prosecute an opponent of his. He didn't use the FCC to leverage what ends up being a $16 million payoff by CBS for a presidential library on a suit that most lawyers thought was pretty bogus. He didn't fire, scores and scores of FBI agents and career prosecutors simply because they did the job that they were assigned to do and prosecute, in this case, the January 6th rioters or otherwise participate in investigations that the president didn't like. I read in the paper just today that they fired a career FBI trainee because he had a pride flag on his desk during the Biden administration. I mean, there's a willingness to use power to go after people in the Trump 2.0 that doesn't come anywhere close to something we saw under previous presidents.
And you also cited in your piece, to just sort of riff on what you were saying a minute ago, look at the indictments that came down in the Biden Justice Department, including his own son.
Yeah.
Right? So you have a Democrat mayor of New York City. You had this Democrat Senator Menendez in Jersey. And so, yeah, it's really hard to say that the Biden administration weaponized the Justice Department with any real credibility. But as a contrast, Trump has been pretty ruthless in how he's sought to punish his enemies. But it just seems even worse than anyone could have predicted, right? I mean, you knew some things were coming, but look at what he's been doing. especially with law firms and universities. Like, I don't think a lot of people saw some of this stuff coming, you know?
I think people, I mean, look, he was fairly open about this in some ways. He did use the word retribution. I am your retribution. I will be about, his second term would be about retribution, he said during the campaign. At one point, he said he was for termination of the Constitution. Termination, that was his word, of the Constitution in order to.
Oh, he's just kidding.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? I think a lot of people took what he said as bluster and, bloviating and so forth and thought, well, he didn't really do some of the stuff in his first term. Yeah, he said lock her up at all those rallies in 2016, but he didn't lock up Hillary Clinton in the end. And so, don't get too worried or don't get don't take it too seriously. And the lesson is, in fact, that he is serious about this stuff. And the difference this time is that he knows what he's doing and how to do it, and surrounded by people who are willing to do it with him. Right. The first term, he came into office as the only president in our history who had never spent a day in public office in the military. So he didn't know how it worked. And he surrounded himself with, in many cases, some conventional Republicans and military officers and people who had experience and believed in the institutions and didn't go along with some of the more extreme things he wanted to do at the time. And so I think people came away from the first term with a misimpression that he didn't really mean this stuff. I think he's now made clear he did mean it.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about Comey, because this is obviously an extraordinary escalation in Trump's effort to punish and prosecute his political enemies. People are saying, we've crossed our Rubicon here. But with Trump, we seem to cross Rubicons every week. But I do think we're at some kind of an inflection point where either we're going to go off to this side, in a very terrible way, or somehow the reins get pulled in on him because of what he just did. And, a lot of legal experts think this will get thrown out, maybe even on a motion to dismiss. So it does seem like we're at a very pivotal point here.
Well, the interesting thing, by the way, and I'm not a lawyer, but the interesting thing is if you actually really want Jim Comey to go to prison, then he's gone about it in exactly the way that won't result in that, because he has given Comey's defense, a really giant argument to make, which is that this is political. And how are they going to prove that in court? They're going to quote the president of the United States and show his actions. I don't know how, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what's allowed and not allowed. But I got to imagine you want to call to the stand, if you get this far in a case, the people who said, no, I'm not going to prosecute this because I don't think it's a case, right? And the way it has come out, so political, it would not surprise me if that they have a hard time making the case stick because a judge will look at that askance. I don't know. Again, not a lawyer. We'll see. I shouldn't make any predictions. Having said that, in some ways, it may not matter to Trump whether he actually wins the case. He has demonstrated a willingness to use the courts in order and to use the process in order to make people's lives miserable. That's, in fact, something he has said out loud. He, long time ago, as a business person, sued my former colleague from the New York Times, Tim O'Brien, because Tim O'Brien wrote a book in which he dared to say that Trump wasn't as rich as Trump said he was. That was the essence of Trump's lawsuit against him. How dare you say I'm not as rich as I really am? And this lawsuit didn't actually succeed at all. But Trump later said it didn't matter that it didn't succeed to him because I made his life miserable, meaning Tim O'Brien's life miserable. And that is, in fact, clearly it would seem a goal of his is to whether he succeeds in getting conviction or not, whether he succeeds in putting somebody in prison or not. These people who are charged or investigated have to spend money on legal fees. It makes getting a job pretty darn hard. And obviously you sit there for months, if not years, worrying about, what the outcome might be.
Yeah, that's all about the cruelty, right? My last question is about Epstein. Did you get a chance to listen to what Lutnick said yesterday? I think it was yesterday on a podcast.
I saw that he said it. I haven't actually listened to it, but yeah, that seemed to not be the official talking points of the administration.
Yeah, I mean, he said that he was at the mansion in the city. He saw the massage tables, and I mean, this is a bombshell, in my opinion. He says that he was told that the massages were all videotaped, and that's how Epstein got the sweetheart deal, because Epstein traded the tapes to the people in charge. I mean, My God, not only is that
ever or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, not only is that just astonishing as a factoid, right? But it completely contradicts what his boss has been saying and what the administration has been saying. So I hope this thing doesn't die over the weekend. It seems like it's going to be interesting how this plays out, because it not only lends credence to all the charges, but you got to wonder what Trump is thinking when he's sitting there munching on a cheeseburger going, what the hell?
It certainly adds fuel to the fire. And I would imagine it encourages the Republicans in the House who are working with Democrats to actually have this discharge petition on their resolution that they want to pass, calling for papers to be released and all that. You're right. I can't imagine Trump thought that was a really great interview. At the same time, Trump is odd on this. Like, he sat next to Elon Musk at the Charlie Kirk funeral, even though Musk is the one who said publicly that, oh my gosh, the Epstein files, this is what this is all about. I mean, Musk himself was out there promoting this when he was mad at Trump, and they had their breakup for however long that's lasted. So Trump is an odd character in that regard, because he's willing to sort of welcome back into the fold people who you wouldn't think would ever be welcomed back in. But yeah, Lutnick, I can't imagine it's a good week for him in the Oval Office.
You and I could spend the next 50 years in psychology studies and still not be equipped to analyze the psychosis of the Trump-Musk relationship.
Yeah.
Peter, thanks so much for coming on. This was a great conversation, and I look forward to next time.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good talking to you.
All righty, take care.
You too.